In this video, we are going to see how to create our own promises. So earlier we understood how, if somebody gives us a promise, how to consume them. We know that how to use then, chaining of then, finally, catch, all those things we know. Now we are trying to create our own promises. So let's say some fetch API is giving us a promise, right? So let's say we are trying to create our own API and we want to return our own promise. So how to create our own promise? So that is what we are going to learn here. So in order to create a promise, JavaScript gives a very simple API that is a promise class. So we can use that using a constructor with a callback argument to a promise class. We can create a new promise object. So the syntax is promise is equal to new promise. This is capital P, and then in that we provide a callback. Now what is this callback? This callback is where we define that when this promise resolves and when this promise rejects. So this callback is a function, and this function is defined something like this. This function takes two arguments, resolve and reject. And whenever you want to resolve this promise, just call resolve with the value with which you want to resolve. And if you want to reject this promise, then call reject with whatever the reason. That can be a error object, that can be a string, whatever. So you call the reject with the reason argument. This is the only way, right? Now until unless you call these things, this promise remains in pending state. That is the first thing. Second thing is that if you call any of them, either resolve or reject, any one of them you call, then immediately the promise becomes settled. Promise becomes settled. Settled means either it has successfully, it has been fulfilled, that is resolved, or it is rejected. And once a promise is successfully resolved or rejected, then after that, even if you again call reject, resolve, does not matter, right? A promise can only be resolved or rejected only once. So let's say you resolved once, after that you call resolve or reject whatever after that many times, it doesn't matter. It will just ignore this. Whatever the first thing you did, that is the only thing which matters. Again, if you simply, let's say, firstly rejected this promise, then after that if you write again resolve or reject, does not matter. Okay, the first time whatever you did, that is the eventual state which the promise has went into. Okay, so let's try this out. So now we are going to create our own promise. P is a new promise. In that we are going to pass our callback. This callback we will later write inline here only, but for now, for clarity, I'm just declaring it separately as some function. And the thing is that this function takes two arguments. Like the first one is resolve, the second one is reject. Okay, we will use this later, resolve and reject variables. But for now, you can understand that p dot then, see, you can see that automatically these p dot then variables and p dot catch and p, all these are automatically available, right? Because JavaScript knows that p is a promise. P is a promise, right? Now again, whatever the data you are getting, that that you can print here, or let's say some error you are getting, that also you can print here. Okay, so this we already know how to use promises. Now let's see how do we create the internals of this. So when we decide that, let's say this promise has to be resolved with some value, so let's say that value is 100, then we simply call resolve with the in argument we provide whatever the value with which you want to resolve. And now if you print this, if you print this, then if you run this, then you are going to see that this 100 is obtained, right? Because this 100 is coming from here, right? So for clarification, you can clearly see that this 100 is coming from here. Okay, now what if we reject this? So let's say we reject this with any string, some error. and you can see that it has gone into error. Now anything, let's say you rather than this, you providing some object with message is equal to something went wrong, doesn't matter what. In case of reject, whatever thing you are passing, that whole thing will come here. Okay, so you can see that the whole object has come here, right? In fact, the best practice is what? The best practice is that you should rather use a error object, right? So you should pass some, you should return some error object with the particular message. So in this case, this thing is a proper error object where you can write again error dot name and error dot message. Okay, and it is available as we saw earlier in the earlier videos. Okay, now first thing, either you can reject or you can resolve. Okay, so first thing, we know that if we resolve it once, then let's say you again reject, you call resolve also, you call reject also. So as we discussed just now, that it does not matter, whatever you do the first time, that thing is done, and that is the eventual state. It does not matter what you do later. Okay, so again this thing will be resolved, and this second thing is just ignored. If you would have done something like this, then again this is rejected, this resolve is ignored. Okay, if you want to see, then you can clearly see here, let's print p after some time. So right now one time I printed p immediately, and let's say after some time, let's say after 100 milliseconds, I'm just printing p. So you can see that p is rejected, right? And you can clearly see that if I resolve it, then p is fulfilled. Fine. Okay, so so that is fine, that is fine. One another thing I wanted to tell you is that if you are passing these values, resolve and reject, right, it does not matter what is the it is just a variable, right? It's just a function and variable, right? So let's say rather than resolve, you just want to pass res and rej, so you can use rej for reject and res for resolve. That is fine. Whatever name you give, whatever is the first argument, that is for resolving, and what is the second argument, that is for rejecting. So whatever ABC, any name you can give, doesn't matter. But generally the practice is to use the resolve and reject full those names. That is the better practice, so that it is clear, right? So you can see that still it is working fine. It is rejecting, right? So it is still working fine. Okay, good. So we have seen that this thing, now this is simply a function, right? So you could have very well created a function like this, right? And this thing will also work fine. Okay, and it's not that you need to return it synchronously. So here you can do some API call based on that response, or let's say if some condition is there, then you resolve, otherwise you reject. So all that thing you can do, right? The point is that it is completely your wish that how you want to use these variables. Okay, when, at what condition you want to use, and whatever will be approached, whether resolve or reject, whatever will be approached first, that is going to be the final settled value. Okay, so I was saying that, yeah, let's say for simplicity we are returning, we are not no need to return, simply you call this function, right? So let's say you call it with 50, then this is the value with which it will be resolved. Okay, now I'm just giving you an example that, yeah, now earlier I was using function keyword, now I'm using arrow function. In fact, the common way which developers use is use an inline function as a anonymous function here directly. Why to create a separate variable? Why to create a separate variable? It's like it might look slightly complicated, but if you understand how it is working, then you can clearly see that writing inline methods directly inside here is somewhat cleaner if you understand it properly. Okay, so now we are going to use later this syntax only. We don't need to declare a new variable function and then use that. Okay, and as you can clearly see, this still works exactly like that. Okay, now we have learned the basic semantics, how to create a promise. Okay, now we know how to create a promise. Now we know how to use or consume a promise. All things we know. Now let's take a few examples. So this is the thing that you can, after the promise is created, then you can use it as we did earlier. So let's take a few example. So let's say our purpose is to create a promise which resolves after some time. So let's say after 1 second or after 2 seconds. In this case it is resolving after 1.5 seconds. So what we are doing is that it is not resolving immediately, but it is resolving after some time. Okay, so let's do that. So rather than resolving immediately, what we are saying that let's do a set timeout and let's give some time. So let's say 2 seconds. After 2 seconds we are going to resolve this. So you see that for 2 seconds nothing is there, and after 2 seconds the output came. Okay, if you want to see the state of the promise, then you can clearly see that after 2 second, okay, so let's keep it 1.5 seconds so that so what are we doing? See, we are doing, we are printing at every 1 second. So initially we printed and we saw that it is pending. Again after 1 second we printed, again it is pending. Why? Because it will resolve after 1500 milliseconds, which is 1.5 seconds, right? Actually, after 1 second it is pending. After 1.5 second the response came, right? And now after 2 seconds, if I print again the promise, then we can clearly see that now it is fulfilled, right? And the same thing will happen if, let's say, rather than resolving, you are rejecting, and you can reject with anything. Let's say reject with 50 only, doesn't matter. You can pass some string or something, that is fine. But you can see that this thing is now rejected. Now again, this error name error object does not make sense here, because we did not pass error object. So just for simplicity, we are just passing the a number or something, that doesn't matter. Okay, so the point is that you can clearly see that this thing is rejected. So we have created a promise which resolves after 1500 milliseconds. Okay, so that is the example which I wanted to give. Again, if you are writing resolve then or reject, whatever, then you can, obviously this is like one liner, so you can write it if you're writing like this, then instead of this you could have very well written like this. Okay, and it does not matter, because whatever you are returning from set timeout callback function, that will be ignored, so that does not matter. After 1.5 seconds we have got 100, that is all. So we have created a timer promise which is resolving after some time. Okay, so this was a very simple example, right? Now let's take a slightly more complicated example, though that is also simple if you understand it. The example which we are trying to do is that we are trying to create a wrapper over fetch, but with timeout. Our requirement is that we know that fetch works, right? We know that fetch works, but our requirement is something like this. Let's see, we are using fetch API. So right now, rather than creating our own promise, let's say simply, earlier what we were using, we were having fetch and some URL was there, and then we had the data. And in this case, since this is a fetch API, so its syntax will be slightly different, which will be response.json, and the data will be available actually in the next then. Okay, so now we understand that this is how we are going to get the data. Yeah, and we have got the response. Okay, that is fine. The point is that what if our requirement is something like that, if this thing does not give us a response within a finite amount of time, then I want to reject this promise. Okay, and right now you can see that yeah, it is like getting very quickly response. In network tab there is a way to there's a way to throttle the network connection. So just if you want to simulate, let's say, offline mode, then you can see that now if you refresh, then there's no internet, even if you have internet, but in this browser tab, this internet is gone because you have set it offline. If you are saying fast 3G, slow 3G, which means that even if you have very high speed broadband, if you refresh, then it will load slightly slowly, and you can see that it is taking some time, and now it has loaded. Okay, so like for testing it is good if you want to test, right? And if this yellow triangle is there, it means that you have tampered with some settings, especially the throttling settings, and that if you forget, then that's why it is showing you yellow triangle. So later you can go and reset that to like no throttling. Okay, but right now let's say we want to throttle. Why? Because we want to test something. We want to test that, let's say, you can see that it is taking some time, 3-4 seconds it is taking, right? So we want to create an API so that if it does not give us a response within, let's say, 1 second, then we are going to say that it is timed out. I cannot wait for more than 1 second. In 1 second, if you get, then that is successful. Otherwise, I will. But then this is a fetch, right? I cannot directly use, though there is a way to configure timeout if you go and read the documentation of fetch. But right now we are learning promises, so using our custom promise, somehow we want to wrap this our fetch inside this. So we are not using now simple this thing, but somehow we want to use our fetch inside some promise, and we want to customize it. Okay, so that is the purpose. So what we can do is that this fetch URL, okay, and then we are going to, if we get data, then we resolve the data. If we get error, then we reject the error. So this is like simple, right? This is simple. This is a simple wrapper. Whatever fetch is doing, exactly you are doing that. But apart from that, you can have a timeout that if till 1 second you did not get any response, then you do reject. Now what happens? Let's say your fetch response comes after 2 seconds. Then after 2 seconds, it gives you this fetch URL gives correct output, right? Correct output means, let's say, a valid response comes and this data and this resolve is called, but then it will be ignored. Why? Because this is being called at 2 seconds, and at 1 second only we called this, and we earlier established this, right? That whenever there is a promise and you resolved or rejected it once, then that is the eventual state, that is the settled state. After that, whatever you call does not matter. So after 1 second, if I have called reject, then even after 2 seconds this thing is called, it will be ignored. Okay, so that is how this thing is going to work. Now let's see it in some action. So we have a promise, right? What we want to do is that if this promise gives us some data, then we are simply going to resolve with that data. if it is going to give us some error, then we are simply going to reject with that error. So right till now, till right now, we have not done anything. It is behaving exactly like earlier. You can see that it is behaving exactly like earlier, right? Now we want to do now something like this, that let's say if till 1 second I did not get a response, so till 1000 milliseconds if I did not get the response, then I am going to reject and then provide something like um, timed out or something like that. Okay, so request is timed out. This is the error, right? Now you can clearly see that since I have done this slow 3G and it will take some time, so when I refresh, then you can see that before the response could come, my request is timed out. Okay, now let's try with fast 3G. So now you can see that the fast 3G response comes before 1 second, and that's why it gives me it prints the response rather than the timed out version. Okay, and obviously if there is no throttling, then it will be very fast. Immediately you get the response, right? So this is the way in which you can customize your fetch. Okay, and this is just an example of just hard coded thing, right? You could have created your own function which might be more generalized. So for example, let's say I create my own function let's say my fetch. This is my custom fetch, right? And it will also get the URL. So some URL is passed from here, right? And then what I will do is that I will create my own promise and return it. Okay, and instead of hard coded, I am just passing that URL, and now I can call my fetch with whatever URL. So you can understand that instead of fetch, I have created a new function, my fetch, and this my fetch is now my custom fetch function, right? Which if it is taking time, then it will time out, otherwise it will. So you see that till here everything is like same, just we have created a wrapper, but apart from that, because of this set timeout, everything is customized as per our behavior, right? So right now you can see that it is working very much fine. If I throttle, then you can see that it timed out. Okay, so this is the example where we created a fetch timeout, fetch with timeout. Okay, so now you can understand that you have understood the basic semantics of how to create your own custom promises, and then you can use this knowledge when you are trying to create your custom utilities in your JavaScript function. Okay, so that will be all for this video. See you in the next one.